So welcome everyone and everyone who's in our virtual live audience in the Zoom room. We're glad that you're here. Those of you who are watching us on YouTube, welcome. I'm Suzanne Wilson. I'm known as the Carefree Medium because I live and work based in Carefree, Arizona. But I also happen to believe that once you are aware of the greater reality that there is no death, that you are an eternal being of light, that you can live a more carefree life, that you can have more inner peace. Right now, we're not living in really peaceful times, are we? We've been facing a worldwide pandemic. Everything we thought we knew about the world has been called into question. Some of us have loved ones who are ill at this time. Some of us have been ill. And some of you watching may have recently lost a loved one in this pandemic. This is the third in my series, my Oneness series of free webinars that I've been offering to bring help, hope, and comfort to all, and to remind us that we are all one. My personal belief is that this pandemic presents us with opportunities to deconstruct that illusion that somehow we are separate from each other, that somehow we are separate from God, the source, the divine, the creator. In truth, we are all connected because we are all souls living physical lives. And it's my personal hope that after things have calmed down, we've restored ourselves and our countries and our businesses and our cultures back to normal, that we don't go back to how we were before, but that we have a kinder, more compassionate, more caring humankind. I've invited some very, very special guests today. This is the installment I'm calling Doctors in Spirituality, where science and spirituality meet. I have three people I'm going to introduce you to. Now, how this works is if you're in our Zoom room, in our virtual audience, you're welcome to type in a question, and we will take a couple of questions a little bit later on. If you're watching on YouTube live, unfortunately, I won't be able to take your questions. However, let me just say that I've received over 60 questions from viewers. And I have a sense that somehow we're going to get at what you most want to know today. These are experts. They are personable, loving, caring physicians. They are scientists. They have worked with life, death, healing. They are authors, and they have a lot of wisdom to share with us. I'm going to introduce each one at a time, and speak with them for just a couple of minutes about who they are. And then I have a few questions that I have culled from all of you who have written me from all over the world. And I do mean all over the world. I actually have a question from China in my question list. And thank you for everybody who is interested in being here. Whether you're watching the replay or whether you're watching this live, I'm hoping that you feel the compassion and the caring that comes through their eyes, their voices, their hearts. These are very special people that they are working and they are busy at this time. And I'm so honored that they're going to share this hour with us. The first person that I'd like to introduce to you, and I think I'm going to go in alphabetical order by first name, is Dr. Connie Mariano. This is a woman who is the first Filipino female U.S. Rear Admiral in the Navy, and I think the first woman White House doctor. She has her own radio show called House Calls. She is a working physician. She's retired from the military, but is still working very hard in executive medicine. And she's been a physician to White House presidents. So I want to welcome Dr. Connie. Dr. Connie, thank you for being here.
There you go. Thanks for inviting me to be on your show, Suzanne. It's a great honor.
Well, I'm thrilled that you could make the time for this because I know that you're as busy as ever. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've experienced and how you got into executive medicine from flying on Air Force One with the President of the United States to Scottsdale, Arizona. Tell us a little bit about your career trajectory.
Well, that journey was mandated by heaven. I had no plans to go to the White House. I had been in the Navy over 10 years in San Diego. And right when I thought I was going to get out of the Navy, I got nominated to go to the White House, went to the White House, and I was the long shot. They had 4 other candidates and myself. And that's when I think spirit started guiding me, because when I went in to be interviewed at the White House, again, I was the long shot. They had already planned to hire somebody else over me. And when I went in to be interviewed, the prayer that I sent was, "Dear God, if this is meant to be, show me a sign." And I walked into that interview, and the sign was actually a single Band-Aid over the forehead of the person interviewing me. And I thought, he's human. And I breezed through that interview, and I was told at the end, "You've got the job." I was supposed to spend 2 years there, and instead it went from 2 to 4 to 8 to 9. And then when it was time to leave, I was getting messages again from Spirit that I had to go to Arizona, of all places. And so I retired from the Navy, came to Arizona, was with the Mayo Clinic for 3.5 years. And once again, more signs, you need to move on. And I formed my concierge practice 15 years ago. And I am a traditionally trained internal medicine physician through the military. It's very traditionally trained, but the spiritual side is the part that allows me to grow. And in a lot of ways, help patients more, because I can present the science part, the statistics, the physiology, the anatomy, but the things that really help them and heal them really is the spiritual side.
So, Dr. Connie, do you sometimes, I know that you do all the requisite science. You've just told us that, and of course you're a physician, but do you ever just look at someone and you know where this is going to go medically?
You sense it. I mean, I've been practicing now, it'll be 39, 38 years now. There's a pattern, series of patterns you see as a physician. I know my colleagues on this panel too, after you see so many quote cases. But when you actually are with the presence of a person, there's something that just either a whisper in the back of your mind or a sense of something there. And I listen to that little voice in the back of my mind. It isn't me. It's spirit, I think, guides me. Before every patient I see, I always pray. I said, "Dear God, dear spirit, show me how to help this person. Show me the signs that I need to see in this person." And I've been able to find people's cancer, even though they had no symptoms. I've been guided down paths where I find people's aneurysms. Why is that? Why would I scan that person? Why would I find that? And obviously it wasn't their time, but then I was able to find things along the way. And for many of my 300 plus patients, I'm their last doctor. I signed their death certificate. So we're in that last chapter about how do you deal with end of physical life, right?
Oh my goodness. So, have you ever been a purely materialist scientist, or have you always been spiritual? Did you start in medicine with your spiritual foundation?
I started spiritual. I'm a very atypical physician. I was born in the Philippines. My father was military. I wanted to go into medicine since I was about 8 years old when we were stationed overseas on a military base. And so I was, again, somebody you always underestimate. Oh, there's no way you can get into med school. I got into the military medical school. There's no way you can get this residency. I got into the residency. Every step along the way is the atypical person who always got chosen to get that job. And I always asked, there was a reason I got chosen for that particular job.
I'm really glad that you followed all of those guideposts that pointed the way, those signs, as you described, and that you were in a conversation with the source. I mean, you talk about praying before each patient. Don't we all hope that our physicians are praying before they see us? Thank you and welcome. Thank you for being here. Dr. Eben Alexander is an academic neurosurgeon, was an academic neurosurgeon for over 25 years, including 15 years at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School in Boston. And he has a very strong and passionate interest in physics and cosmology, and more recently in sound and acoustics and the healing properties and collecting the data on how sound helps us to heal. 3 books, the bestseller Proof of Heaven, The Map of Heaven, and Living in a Mindful Universe is the latest book. So Dr. Eben, welcome.
Suzanne, thanks so much for having me on. It's a real pleasure to be here today.
We're glad that you're here as well. So tell us a little bit about your trajectory in your career, and were you in the beginning a materialist scientist?
Well, it's important to start with kind of my origins. My family, my father in particular, a tremendous influence on my life. And he had grown up during the Depression. His own father had taken him to the Presbyterian Church in Eastern Tennessee every day of his life. His father was a general surgeon. My father went into academic neurosurgery, so he was very scientific. And he was a combat surgeon in the Second World War, spent almost 2 years in the Pacific Theater. And I think it was his strong faith in God and in the power of personal prayer, a personal God that responded to prayer that helped him to survive that World War II episode, and then guided a lot of his work as a chairman of a neurosurgical training program. And the house I grew up in was very scientific, but for him, there was never any conflict whatsoever. Now, of course, I grew up in the 60s and 70s, and like many of that generation, I came to realize early on that science is absolutely the pathway to truth. And I promise you, I'm more of a scientist now than I've ever been. But I also realized, because of my near-death experience back in 2008, which was in the setting of severe gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis. And the good news is there's now a case report out on my medical records that makes it very clear how ill I was. And in fact, the doctors who wrote that report, it came out in Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, September 2018. And the doctors who wrote it were not involved in my care, but they were fascinated by my recovery. When you go through that case report and realize what was going on there, you realize this is not just some bad case of meningitis. This is one that I really should never have had any experience in or really had a full recovery from. I mean, my doctors at the time estimated, at the beginning of the week in coma, 10% chance of survival, by the end of the week, 2% chance, with no chance of recovery. And that's why I think this medical case report is so important. In fact, one of the steps they had to take to get it published in the peer-reviewed medical literature was come up with an explanation, because when you review the medical records, it doesn't make sense that, this could lead to a full recovery. That's the thing that haunted me so much when I was first reviewing my medical records. And remember that review started in those months after my coma, when most of my neuroscience knowledge still had not come back to me.
Well, so for all intents and purposes, you should be dead.
Well, or at least, about the best they expected at the end of that week in coma was that I'd survive, in a nursing home for a few months and then succumb to the illness, but that I'd never wake up from it. That's the part that's such a shocker, is that over 2 months, I actually had a full return of all my memories. But getting back to your question, so I spent much of my life, going to a Methodist church as a youth, wanting to believe all that power of prayer and everything I'd been taught. But more and more of my time as a neurosurgeon, I just couldn't understand how conscious awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. So in a sense, the science that I studied so deeply was, a materialist form of science that takes a lot of physicalist presuppositions and assumes they're true, including, the brain creates consciousness and that our existence is nothing more than birth to death, and that's it. And my journey showed me, no, that's not even remotely true. Our consciousness is a far, far bigger kind of entity to try and describe than anything I'd ever entertained before. And the good news is that the scientific data, and I've spent the last 11 plus years since my coma working with other scientists around the world on consciousness. And there is absolutely no question in my mind, there's a tremendous revolution going on now that's going to make the Copernican revolution look like child's play. And that has to do with our notion of reality, where consciousness is primordial. And it's important to get this because some of the deepest lessons that come out of near-death experiences in the modern scientific study of consciousness are really that we're sharing one mind, that we're all in this together. And of course, near-death experiencers very commonly have life reviews where you realize that it's the emotional impact on others that you experience in a life review, not necessarily those interactions, from your perspective. It's very interesting. It's kind of like the life review is like the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, written into the very fabric of the universe. And that's why I think these lessons are so crucial. They're completely consistent with the front edges of emerging science about quantum physics, about neuroscience of consciousness, philosophy of mind. And this is where it gets very, very exciting.
So how does the human experience that we're having now coming through this pandemic, how do you think this plays into this new epoch?
Well, what I would say is that in many ways, the COVID pandemic is revealing to us some very serious flaws in our social system and our economic system, in the way we take care of people. And these are flaws that have to do with fundamental errors in our assumptions about the nature of reality, especially, I would say, materialist science that I worshiped. And I do not use that word lightly, but for the first 54 years of my life before my coma, I worshiped materialist science. And I believe that that was the way to truth. And I would ignore things like, thousands of anecdotes about near-death experiences, shared death experiences, all the, many things that show us the reality of non-local consciousness. And this worldview shift is very important because, as most near-death experiencers will attest, we really are all in this together. And it's through that binding force of love. And even as a neurosurgeon fascinated by mind and consciousness, my partner, Karen Newell, is the one who really kind of forced it home on me that this is about love and heart consciousness. I knew that from my near-death experience. It was crystal clear. And yet working it into my bigger scientific worldview was something that I had to work on for several years before it started to fall into place. But it has to do with the lessons of the COVID pandemic, about the inadequacies of our healthcare system for providing for people, about the socioeconomic inequalities and polarization. We have kind of a rigged system that does not broadly share the economic successes of this world with all beings, and we're all souls. We're all in this together. And that's where I would say the COVID pandemic, combined with this awakening in our scientific understanding of the nature of reality, of consciousness, brain and mind, their relationships, and what this life is all about, and how our choices are important. All of this is packaged together as, I think, a crucial lesson where I often put out there that the COVID pandemic, in many ways, I see will make us smarter, stronger, and definitely much more cohesive as a society because of what it exposes as errors in our assumptions about reality that participate in the kind of scale of this pandemic and its repercussions.
There's no running and hiding from truth of the
There's not. And,
have.
all the kind of bluster and bravado in our political polarized system, that doesn't work against a virus. So it's kind of like a litmus test to, are we really in touch with reality? Do we know how to take care of each other and figure these kind of things out? Well, yes, I believe we do, but it takes serious hardship, challenge, and difficulty, just like in our individual lives. The hardships and difficulties are really gifts that come packaged that help us to grow. And likewise, I would say that this COVID pandemic, in many ways, is like a gift of desperation. That's a concept in alcoholism and addiction work, where you realize if you hit a bottom that's strong enough, maybe that'll energize your recovery, as opposed to just going on to die. That's why a bottom is such a crucial concept. And it also has to do with realizing that we are not our ego, because the ego is what gets you into so much trouble in those addiction and alcoholism kind of scenarios. But we're much more than that. And that's where I think meditation can be very helpful. We can identify as a far grander soul, more connected than our little ego would like to allow. So I just see all of this as a beautiful opportunity for discussion that strengthens us, makes us smarter, makes us realize that we actually have tremendous influence on our emerging reality. The materialist science that I worship pre-coma would even try and convince you nobody even has free will. So I would say, let's just throw that one out the window. They said that because they thought it's all just chemical reactions in the brain, electron fluxes. There's no way you could inject any kind of, will of a sentient being. And yet I'd say that's because they had it completely backwards. And now we're moving into territory where the scientific view is one that expands greatly to accept all these possibilities.
So this is an opportunity for building something better, something that really speaks to the essence of humanity, which is we are all in this together. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Eben. We appreciate
Thank you
you.
for having me. Great to be here.
Now, Dr. Jeff, interesting. You gave me a statistic right before we started that less than 5% of medical schools require their students to take a course on death and dying. Now, you have a background of being an emergency room physician, and now you're a mentor to people, and your book is called Not Now, and you've also had a near-death experience. Tell us a little bit about your trajectory in your career.
Well, I could relate a lot with Connie when she said things kind of lined up to put her in certain places at certain times. That's how I felt about my medical training, from medical school to residency to my job in the emergency department. Looking back, it all seems to have been lined up by some force other than myself. And I also related when she said she started, she saw every patient with a prayer or a centering, if you will. That's how I started virtually every shift in my emergency department, just by myself before I went into the department, I should say, not with all the staff. I like Eben, I had a very materialistic kind of view of science and medicine, a very traditional Western training. But since I was a small child, I'd always felt like I knew that I was an eternal being, that I existed before I was born and that I'll continue to exist afterwards. And so I always had this juxtaposition of spirituality with my medical training, and they never seemed to be in conflict for me. In fact, Eben will relate with this as a neurosurgeon. I remember on one occasion, a patient came in and he had a minor motorcycle crash. He had on a helmet, full protective gear, no signs of injury, but the emergency medical people strapped him to a backboard and drug him to the emergency department. And I went in to see him and he was fine. And there's specific criteria to evaluate somebody for a neck injury or a head injury. We see whether they need to have any kind of imaging studies. And he didn't meet any criteria for any imaging at all. And I was about to take his collar off and let him get up and leave, which is what he wanted to do. And I had this knowing that he needed a head scan. And there was no explanation for it at all. There was no scientific rationalization to do it. But he allowed me to do it. And normally I'd get the result back in about 20 minutes. And about 15 minutes later, the radiologist actually called me. He had what's called an epidural hematoma. The blood was accumulating inside his skull so rapidly, the radiologist could see it swirling. And when I went back to see him, he was getting drowsy. And because I worked in a trauma center, I had a neurosurgeon available, and he was in the OR 15 minutes later and getting a burr hole, which sounds like a big deal, but he was probably back on his motorcycle within a couple of weeks. And
Wow.
if I'd have let him get up and go home that night, he almost certainly would have died. And there was no scientific explanation to why he should get a CAT scan. So my brother died in a farm accident when I was 11. And shortly after that, I started to get messages from him. Sometimes they'd come in auditory kind of signals. Sometimes he started to show me things visually in a spiritual sense. And I kind of grew into it over a period of decades. So by the time I got to the emergency department, it felt completely natural to me. And I haven't had a near-death experience like Eben's, but my experiences were what we call shared death experiences sometimes. And I actually had patients, when they passed, I actually saw their souls leave their bodies, and they communicated with me before they left this realm. But I never spoke about it for 25 years while I was practicing medicine, and only recently have I started to talk about it. And finally, as you mentioned, I finally wrote some of those experiences in my book, Not Yet. So I'm glad to be with you.
I'm really glad that you started talking about that. You know, when I was a child, I would accompany my preacher granddad to the nursing homes. Back then, everyone died in a nursing home or at home. There wasn't such a thing as hospice. And I remember I would see them leave their body and wave at me as they were leaving. And these are people that I would see every Sunday afternoon, and they would hold my little hand and I'd squeeze their hand. And then they made sure to say goodbye to me. And I just thought every child saw things like that. So it's amazing to hear a physician talking about seeing people as they pass. Now, you had an experience that was very remarkable with a homeless man. Do you mind sharing that?
I went into a room one night in the emergency department. It was kind of a wintry night. And there was snow on the ground, and there was a patient in the room, and he had long hair and an unkempt beard. He was in tattered clothing and soiled clothing. He was homeless, and he had addiction issues. He was the antithesis of everything society defined as being successful. And he had holes in his shoes and holes in his socks, and his feet were in bad shape from walking around in the snow. And I knew what needed to be done. He knew what needed to be done. And I got a wash basin, I filled it with some tepid water and soap, and I sat down at the foot of the gurney, and I took off his shoes and pulled off the last threads of his socks and lowered his feet into the water, and I began to wash his feet. And something miraculous happened. Whether you call it a veil or whatever term you use, something was drawn back from him, and I saw who he was. I saw his soul. And I've described it in my book as I saw God, because I saw that portion of him that was eternal and divine. And I realized later that night that I'd gone into the room thinking that I was going to serve him or minister to him. And I left realizing that he was there ministering to me. Because when I realized who he was, it changed the way I looked at every other patient after that, because they were all the same. We're all divine. We're all eternal. We're all connected. And I gave him my shoes. He wore my shoes home that night, and I went home and wet cold feet. But I had a home to go to, and I had a dozen more pairs of shoes at home. But that patient is always stuck in my mind to teach us something about who we are and who everybody else is.
Talk about a litmus test. It's a test of the soul that you were willing to see what was gifted to you to see in that moment. How would your life have been different if you had turned away from that dropping of the veil? If you'd said, "Oh, no," how do you think your life would be now?
That's hard to say. You know, every scrap of experience teaches us something. In fact, I had a messenger come to me once and said, every experience is to enable you to help someone else. I said, whoa, wait a minute. I thought experiences were for personal growth, and then we could go help people if we wanted to. And my messenger said, the primary purpose of every experience is to enable you to help someone else. You get the secondary benefit of personal growth. Now, I don't know if that applies to anybody but me. I just know that's what I was told that day. And so it changed the way I viewed the world. When I have a rough experience, something hard happens to me, I try to ask, what am I supposed to learn from this? And how can I use it to help someone else?
And that is something that we could apply in our daily lives every single day, couldn't we? Thank you for being here. That's I started to get in tears as you're talking about the homeless man, because that's one of those moments when you realize trauma is the great leveler, you know, when we're all in the same situation. And this pandemic is the great leveler.
Yes,
I don't care who you are.
I've said before, and I honestly believe this, pain makes us all alike. Empathy makes us one.
And empathy in action is compassion. Thank you. I'm so glad that the three of you are here. Dr. Connie, I have a question specifically for you. And this one comes from a lady in Italy who's asking how stressful it must be and how stress affects someone like a president and their health and the executives that you treat, and what kinds of things now that we're all in pressure and extremities. You know, it's so extreme. Like my mother is 78 years old. She can't see her grandchildren. They stand outside and they look in the window and wave and talk to her that way. But at least my mother's not in a nursing home getting sick. We all have our pressures, and you've dealt with, you know, the leaders of the free world. What kinds of pressures do they have, and how does this affect our immune system? And this question was about 5 paragraphs long, so I tried to summarize as best I could.
You know, having taken care of 3 presidents and observing them over 9 years, they've all dealt with stress. They wouldn't be there had they not conquered stress in some ways. A lot of them will compartmentalize, they'll delegate. I think this particular time and what they do is difficult because of lack of control. There's absolutely nothing they can do in terms of fighting this virus. I mean, they can try various measures. You can't eradicate it completely. You can mitigate the impact of it. But the fact that they have to study it, they have to try to catch up, and it shows how we are unprepared in so many ways in terms of we don't have a vaccine. We don't know exactly what medicines we're using. Our hospitals are understaffed. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough of the equipment to do that. But I think the fact that we were caught off guard, that we can't control it, that we're powerless. And I think that's the part that frustrates presidents, because they say, you know, I'm the leader of the free world. I have no power. I mean, I'm all about power. And something greater than us is really in charge. And to let go of that, I think that's really hard for them, is to accept that there's something larger than that. How do they handle it? You know, you surround yourself with people who are supportive. You hopefully have people who advise you, and then you make a decision. And then you try to be at peace with those decisions. And I see it among my patients. I have 320 CEOs and their families, and I see so much anxiety because they can't be in control of what's going on. And I said, let's just keep yourself healthy. Let's keep your immune system good. Make sure you get plenty of sleep, that you exercise, that you nourish your body, and that you meditate and you pray, and that you see what happens, right? We're going to get through this. And if you get sick, you call me, we'll help you. But right now, let's pause. Let's pause and reflect, and then find some of the good that comes out of this, which is connecting with friends and family. It's your time to be at home with your spouse and your loved ones. Use that time. It's the only time you're going to have with that. And use it to pray, use it to meditate, use it to connect with spirituality. That's the pause button. And then when we finally resume the normal, it won't be normal. It'll be a new normal. Draw from this difficult experience something good that you can enhance your life better to make you a better soul.
Did you advise the presidents that you were their personal physician? Did you advise them to pray and meditate?
I did. I did at times, because you have that close relationship. You see them every day. You see them at the White House. You're on Air Force One. And you try not to be intimidated by their titles. And you try to find the soul. It isn't the external anymore. You try to figure who you're trying to help through this. And you encourage them to do that. And, you know, I've taken care of people in the media, at the press, all the press pool. And you try to look beyond the superficial into who you're really treating. It's really soul.
Amazing. Well, that's interesting to know that that you have that kind of relationship where you sound like you were like a really good friend in a way to these presidents as their doctor, as opposed to just coming in and taking a temperature and doing tests and things like that. You're more of a confidant in a way.
Yeah, you do, because they tell you things that they'll only trust with a few people. And it's a great honor to be within that, among just like any other patients that will reveal you things that I always tell them, whatever's said in my exam room stays here, and that it's between us, and that you're there just to help them in difficult times, and acceptance, and you don't judge them.
Well, thank you for that. Now, in near-death experiences, sometimes we hear music. I know I heard amazing music, I had anaphylaxis. And of course, I was brought back. I was only out of my body for a few seconds because it happened in a doctor's office during allergy testing. What better place to code than in a doctor's office? The music that I heard went in waves, in a continual crescendo. It was in a major key, which those of you who are musicians or like music will know what I mean. And it was so comforting. It came in waves. And so, Dr. Eben, I remember reading that you heard amazing music on the other side. Is that what sparked your interest in using music and sound for healing?
Well, I think it's important to point out my experience, in coma, and as I reported in Proof of Heaven, really pointed out the how in many ways we use music, vibration, frequency in some form of, as far as I'm concerned, that's how we traverse those various spiritual levels. I mean, for me, there was a musical, kind of a perfect musical melody that was associated with a light portal that opened up from my earth from my view into that brilliant ultra real Gateway Valley. And then the angelic choirs above in that Gateway Valley provided yet another musical portal to higher and higher levels, all the way to oneness with the divine in a space that easily contained all of infinity and eternity. I mean, the core realm, as I call it. But important to point out that music in those realms is not limited like the music we hear here with our ears and our physical brains and the limitations of four-dimensional space-time. Music there, kind of like in Plato's world of ideals, it's an ideal form of music, and that's why it can work so beautifully. And now, you also mentioned my connection with using differential frequency sound or brainwave entrainment. And for people who want to learn more about that, they can go to sacredacoustics.com. It's certainly something we talk about a lot in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But there's a kind of a misinterpretation out there that what I was seeking was to duplicate the kind of sounds I had heard on my journey. And for me, I realized that those sounds cannot be duplicated in a four-dimensional space-time. Our physics won't allow it. And so what we do instead with Sacred Acoustics is a beautiful example of this, is to use slight differences in the frequency of tones. This is an effect called binaural beats, which was originally discovered in the mid-19th century by a Prussian physicist named Dove. But the reason these sounds can be so powerful at engendering transcendental states of conscious awareness, which is how I use Sacred Acoustics on a daily basis, is because this differential frequency is actually addressing a circuit in our lower brainstem. Very different from all the sounds, chants, anthems, and hymns you might have ever listened to. Those are all processed up in the recently evolved neocortex, in the acoustic cortex of the temporal lobes. And that processing is in circuits that arose in the last 1 to 10 million years of evolution. Very different are sounds like Sacred Acoustics, those binaural beats that are going after a circuit in the lower brainstem that's more than 300 million years old. And so in essence, I think the way we think this works is a general principle in evolutionary biology has to do with if you want to get to the root of some function, go back into the evolution and anatomy of it. And we can follow that in our own brain, way down into the lower brainstem to these ancient circuits that arose before mammals even existed on Earth. And that's where I believe they have so much power. But I just to cut to the chase, I use these kinds of differential frequency sounds on a daily basis, as I said, not just to recover memories of my near-death experience, but in fact to develop an ongoing kind of relationship that is eternally manifesting new lessons for me. It's like an ongoing active NDE that I can do through meditation. Although I must say I've never fully duplicated that sense of ultra reality that I had in my NDE, especially in the Gateway Valley and in the core realms. I've never fully come to face with that in my meditative efforts, even though it gets better and better. So I'm just hoping that over time, this kind of driving mechanism of tones like Sacred Acoustics can help a lot of people to get into a richer relationship with that primordial mind and that kind of higher soul that I think we have access to when we leave the ego and the linguistic voice, which is generated by a piece of brain about that big, and it calls itself dominant hemisphere. But we can let all that go. I love looking at that stream of thoughts in our head, our little ego voice, the way Michael Singer puts it, the annoying roommate. And then in meditation, the first thing I can do is I can let that linguistic voice of my ego state an intention or make a request, but then it goes into timeout. And
well, can the
me,
binaural beats, the sacred acoustics, can these as therapies be adjunctive to healing for chronic disease and illnesses?
You raise a very important point. And yes, in fact, there was just a pilot study published in the peer-reviewed medical literature in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M, New York psychiatrist, who did this pilot study using sacred acoustics, theta, delta, and alpha tones in her patient population in Manhattan. And what she found is over 2 weeks, she had a 26% reduction in the significant symptoms of anxiety and depression in this patient population, compared to 9% in controls during that period, which is a pretty remarkable kind of success rate. And you're right, especially in this time of the COVID pandemic, there's a tremendous amount of anxiety over the economic uncertainties and the kind of health challenge of having all these people sick and a large number of people dying from this illness. Lots of anxiety, and that's why I think this pilot study from Dr. Yusim, which just came out in February of 2020, is very instructive. And in fact, Dr. Yusim and Karen Newell, the co-founder of Sacred Acoustics, and I have started a series of webinars to help address this. And people can get to that through going to unitedinhopeandhealing.com. And there you'll find these free webinars and access also to there's a teacher training course for medical health professionals that's also bundled in there in that United in Hope and Healing.com website. And a 9-hour video course that Dr. Yusim and Karen Newell and I have put together to help all manner of people, not just therapists, but people who want to take charge of their own anxiety to try and kind of approach it through techniques that have been very well proven in this pilot study and through other evidence that we have. You can go to Sacred Acoustics to learn a lot more about that.
Well, what about the people who say, I can't meditate, so why should I even try this?
Well, I think that's exactly the story that Karen would tell you, because she was years and years pursuing lots of that kind of knowledge, but claiming that she had no ability to meditate because her monkey mind would just take over. That's why I mentioned this business about the linguistic brain, that little ego voice, and the importance of turning it off. And you can do that quite easily, at least many people can, using Sacred Acoustics. And there's a lot of direction at sacredacoustics.com. She has some free training videos to help people kind of learn a few of the important kind of concepts and worldview lessons to help them do this. But it's a very powerful technique that allows you to escape the limitations of your little ego voice. And that includes the little voice of kind of rational and logical knowledge in your head, because I mean, creativity is something that goes wide open in this kind of Sacred Acoustics and this kind of opening of the veil, the filtering mechanism of the brain, into much broader regions of conscious awareness. And that's where I think all of our creativity really comes from. We talk about a lot of that in Living in a Mindful Universe, and like Einstein, Edison, Robert Louis Stevenson, Salvador Dali, all these creative geniuses, and how they use different techniques to get into that hypnagogic space to enhance their creativity. It's basically enhancing your relationship with that primordial mind and information we can glean from the universe. And it's very useful in living your life to develop those relationships with higher soul and with primordial mind.
Well, I can tell you that some of my students in my intuition and mediumship development courses have done Sacred Acoustics, have worked with the binaural beats, and now have spontaneous out-of-body experiences, now have an increase in lucid dreaming and astral travel, all very positive, helpful, right, hopeful healing experience.
It's very positive, and we can use these kind of techniques to really help the world, because what they also do is drive home that lesson of NDEs, that we're all really sharing one mind and we're all in this
Online.
together. And to hurt another is to hurt oneself. So why would we do that? And this is where the real growth can come in, and people can use meditation to get there. But ultimately, what it means is taking action in this world, seeing injustice, standing up for the least, the last, and the lost. I mean, we're really here to take care of each other, and that's where people get true benefit. Like in a pandemic like this, people who are feeling lost and bored at home, well, this is a great time to help others. I love what Jeff said earlier about his lesson from washing the feet of that homeless man. I mean, it almost brings tears to my eyes. It brought such a similar lesson that I experienced in my journey of just witnessing the oneness that we all share. We truly are deeply here to take care of each other. And Jeff's telling of that story just reminds me so much of what I see emerging around this world now as we awaken in consciousness and take some of these lessons to heart and learn what they're trying to teach us about our oneness.
Yeah, let's not slip back into the old normal when things normalize again. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Another question I have here, and this is the question, actually, I think I've received about 25 iterations of the same question. And I'm going to shoot this to Dr. Jeff. And if either Dr. Connie or Dr. Eben want to weigh in, please do. So Dr. Jeff, so many people are asking, why are some people carrying COVID-19, but they're asymptomatic, while others get the full-blown disease? There are medical reasons, are there spiritual reasons, and what's your take on that?
Oh, well, yes, there are medical reasons, and yes, there probably are spiritual reasons as well. Virtually all illnesses, infectious illnesses that is, affect some people more powerfully than others. And it's not at all uncommon for people to be asymptomatic, to be carriers in essence, if you will. I mean, Typhoid Mary, that people have probably heard that name. She was a carrier. She was an asymptomatic carrier, and she was spreading illness all over, and it was taking lives right and left. And one of the big challenges of this current pandemic is collecting enough data to know what to expect. We don't know how strong somebody's immunity is going to be or how long it's going to last, whether the virus is going to mutate and come back in another form in short order. We don't have an idea of the number of people in the population that have been exposed that have immunity despite never having had symptoms, so we can't predict herd immunity. All of these things are still unknowns in large measure with this pandemic. But as Eben mentioned earlier, and perhaps Connie as well, one of the things that's so powerful about the pandemic spiritually is it demonstrates the fact that we indeed are all one. And our actions have impact on other people, even if they don't have impact on us, even if we don't get the infection, if we spread it, even if we don't get symptoms, if we cause somebody else to have symptoms or even to die. We are all one, and the way we act impacts all those around us. And it's a powerful spiritual lesson as well as a medical one.
Indeed. I appreciate your take on that. Dr. Connie, would you like to weigh in?
I totally agree with Dr. Jeff. There are people who are predisposed. Definitely this virus has a poor outcome in the elderly and those with underlying chronic medical conditions like kidney problems, liver, lung disease, diabetes. So many of those things predispose people to poor outcomes. Look at the people in the nursing homes who so many people died there just by that. But it's true, there are asymptomatic carriers of this. Again, until we get the prevalence and we're able to test everybody else to see how many are out there, who the actual prevalence of it and how many people have some immunity to it based on the IgG testing, we really won't know for sure. Out of my 320 patients, I'm certain one of mine did have it. 75-year-old patient of mine in Carefree, in fact, who called me up about 3 weeks ago, had a fever of 101.5, muscle aches, sore throat, dry cough, wasn't short of breath. And his son had contacted him and had been with them about 7 days prior, was visiting from New York City. Around the time my patient Carefree was sick, his son was back in New York. had a fever of 104. And my patient declined being tested. He said, I'm just going to stay home. I'm going to hydrate. I'm going to isolate myself. In 2 days, he was better. He says, I feel great. I'm much better. I said, well, still, isolate yourself. This is a person, 75 years old, who did a 20-mile bike ride 2 days prior. So you look at how people are resilient, how well they take care of themselves, and their attitude, had amazing attitude. He said, I can get through this. I just need to take care of my body, hydrate, eat the right things, take my supplements, get some rest, and then I'll let you know how I do. And that's what he wanted to do.
So every situation seems to be unique then.
Yes.
It's heartbreaking that the African-American community in this country, in the US, it seems to be taking the brunt of the severity of the illness and the deaths, at least from the reports that I've read. There's an opportunity here for more compassion in action here, isn't there?
There is, and you'll see it among our healthcare workers, and I know Dr. Jeff can talk more because people gain access to emergency rooms, but our heroes here have been our hardworking healthcare workers in hospitals and the ERs who get to triage these patients as they come in.
Dr. Jeff?
Oh, I was just going to point out that many diseases have different impact on different racial minorities. And that's been known for a long time, but also part of what's driving the disproportionate impact upon minority communities with COVID is the occupations and the living circumstances that they are in. We tend to deem, for example, transit as an essential service that must keep running, and a lot of minorities are in transit. They're in grocery stores. They're in services which are essential and important. And I think one of the important lessons for us to learn is that we shouldn't look at the importance of what people do based on their salary, and we should do something about moderating the disparities in the income of the people, because what we do, every one of us, what we do is essential in some way or another.
Yes, thank you for saying that. We're coming to the end of our hour, and there's so many questions I'd love to ask all of you, but what I'm going to do is encourage everyone to go to these fine physicians, these fine spiritual people's websites, read their books, take advantage of opportunities, the radio shows. So in closing, I'm going to go to each one of you and ask, what do you most hope that humankind takes from this experience? And tell us how people can find you. Dr. Eben?
Yes, well, people can find me at Eben, EBEN, Alexander.com. Again, about the meditation, I would steer people to sacredacoustics.com. To our effort to help people in facing anxiety, especially in this pandemic era, and to participate in the webinars that we've designed to help with that. Go to unitedinhopeandhealing.com, and you can learn a lot more. I think, to me, I'm really very optimistic about what I think this pandemic is bringing to us. For one thing, it is demanding that we all around this world take action. Social distancing is crucial to making this work. But even more importantly, I think, and this kind of echoes points that your other two guests have made, I think it's really crucial that we revamp so much of our modern society that has been misled for decades, if not centuries, into this kind of materialist mindset of separation, and also a complete misinterpretation of Darwinian evolution to suggest that only competition matters in biological systems. Where I think
thank you for saying that. I had several questions about that. Is this just selection? Is the Earth just purging people who don't need to be here? And
No. Most biologists would tell you that when you look broadly, that this world works successfully through cooperation and collaboration. And even Charles Darwin said that in The Descent of Man. He mentions, survival of the fittest twice. He mentions the word love 98 times. It wasn't Darwin himself who actually misinterpreted all this to focus on that competition. It was people like Thomas Huxley who kind of hijacked that message. But it's a big discussion, but I would say in essence, it was kind of the misinterpretation of 20th century science that led a lot of social science down a wrong pathway. And this is time for us to all wake up and realize that our choices matter, that every soul is crucial. We're all truly in this together. And the most important thing we can do here as sentient beings is to take care of each other. The pandemic is a beautiful reminder of that. It will kind of force us to do things so that the outcome is optimized. And it will also allow us to learn tremendous lessons about the problems of our past system and the economic inequalities and the kind of power structure. A lot of things wrong with it that we need to now correct and take care of all people, refugees. We need to take care of every soul on this planet. And I think that the COVID pandemic is a beautiful wake-up call to help us get there.
Thank you. And thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So Dr. Jeff, are you taking mentoring clients now? How do we find you? How do people work with you? And what would you most hope that people learn and take away from this experience of the pandemic?
I think the big lesson from the pandemic is that we are all one, and the way we behave affects each other. And we can learn great lessons from this for our future, both materialistically and spiritually. In addition to my book, not yet, you're correct. I do intuitive mentoring. When people started talking to me about my book after I wrote it, we'd have these long conversations, and I unexpectedly realized that sometimes I could discern people's gifts, spiritual gifts that they didn't even know they had. And so I work with people now to learn how to recognize their gifts, how to step into their divine nature, how to connect with their highest self and get their own answers, because they don't need my answers, they need their own. So that's my motive when I mentor people, and they can reach me through my website, jeffodriscoll.com, no apostrophe in that because you can't put an apostrophe in a web address, or they can reach me through helpingsoulsheal.com, same website.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you. And Dr. Connie, tell us about your radio show. Tell us about your book, The White House Doctor, My Patients for President. How do people reach you or work with you, or at the Executive Medicine Center that you're the CEO? Tell us about that. And your hope for the takeaway from this experience that we're
Thanks,
having.
Suzanne. Patients can actually interested people can reach me on my website, www.drcmariano.com, about my practice. The book, The White House Doctor, My Patients for President, you can get a copy on Amazon. My radio show, House Calls with Dr. Connie, is it's actually once a month on a Thursday, the third Thursday of the month, on the Empowerment Channel, Voice America Network. And finally, I want to thank the other two esteemed doctors on your panel for their words of wisdom. I've learned so much from them and been so inspired. And I think we're all sort of singing from the same sheet of celestial music about how we are really one, how we're connected. And it took, sadly, a virus to show how really connected we are, that one person's action impacts so many other lives. And that my hope that when we come out of this into a quote new normal, it'll be one of understanding that what I do impacts the lives of so many people. And that even though the virus was invisible, so are things such as faith, hope, and love are invisible things, but that what you can see is their impact on the lives of people. So thanks again.
And thank you for being here. Faith, hope, and love. Even though the virus is not seeable, faith, hope, and love are not seeable, but they live, and they are so much stronger. Thank you, everyone who is watching this live. Thank you to everyone who's watching the replay. Our hope and prayer for you is that you have found something helpful, hopeful, and healing here today. Know that none of us is ever really alone, that we're all children of a divine source. This too shall pass. And when we finally finish and hit the play button again, we will have a new normal of a more compassionate humankind that takes better care of each other and our earth. Thank you for being here. I'm Suzanne Wilson. You can find me at carefreemedium.com. I'm an intuition and mediumship educator, metaphysical researcher, and author. Take care.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.